1840. Fix that single year in your mind. Not a vague decade, not a broad historical era, just 1840. In the space of those 12 months, three entirely independent expeditions, one flying the American flag, one the British Union Jack, one the French tricolor, each turned their ships toward the same forbidding, icebound continent, Antarctica. Each one reached its frozen coastline within a few months of the others. For a long time, I accepted the conventional explanation without question. It was the height of the age of exploration. Nations were racing to fill in the last blank spaces on the world map. Parallel voyages made perfect sense. Scientific curiosity, national prestige, imperial ambition colliding in the same remote corner of the planet. Coincidence, yes, but a logical one. Then I stumbled across something small but impossible to unsee. It was a single line, hidden in a footnote to the original, unexpurgated log of Charles Wilkes's expedition. A passage that his superiors had quietly removed before the report was ever printed for the public. 7 ordinary-sounding words, formations inconsistent with any natural process known. 7 words. That was all it took. Once I read them, the whole accepted story began to feel thinner, less solid. And then, half a century later, another piece surfaced. A survivor from the very first expedition that deliberately chose to spend an entire winter on the Antarctic continent, led by the Norwegian-British explorer Karsten Borchgrevink, gave one guarded interview many years after the fact. In it, he spoke, almost reluctantly, of his crew seeing what appeared to be cities buried beneath the ice. That particular section of the interview was not translated into English for another 60 years. Those 2 fragments were enough. After that, I could no longer pretend the standard narrative was complete. Let's begin, carefully, with what the official historical record actually says, what appears in textbooks, what governments chose to publish, what polite history has allowed us to know. Jules Dumont d'Urville, French Antarctic Expedition. D'Urville sailed from Toulon in September 1837 with clear instructions. Push farther south than any French ship before, claim new territory for France, collect scientific specimens, and leave the tricolor flying over ice if possible. He succeeded. He returned in November 1840, having charted and named Adélie Land after his wife. In France, he was hailed as a national hero, decorated, celebrated. But the story does not end there. In May 1842, just 18 months after his triumphant return, he, his wife Adèle, and their young son boarded a train traveling from Versailles to Paris. Near the village of Meudon, the train derailed catastrophically. A fire broke out and consumed the wreckage. Dumont d'Urville, his entire family, and reportedly a number of sensitive expedition documents he was personally transporting for official review, all perished in the blaze. Train accidents were tragically common in the early years of rail travel. Random tragedy happens. I am not claiming this was anything more. I am only asking you to notice the timing. Hold that detail in your mind alongside the others. James Clark Ross, British Antarctic Expedition. Ross was perhaps the most respected polar navigator of his generation. Under British command, he reached what would later bear his name, the Ross Ice Shelf. A colossal perpendicular wall of ice, towering hundreds of feet above the sea and stretching away for hundreds of miles, like the white cliffs of Dover, only frozen, endless, and utterly forbidding. He described it in his published account as impenetrable, staggering, a barrier that stopped him completely. His official narrative is a masterpiece of Victorian scientific prose, calm, precise, restrained, almost clinical. Yet when researchers finally gained access to the raw, unedited crew logs submitted privately to the Admiralty, logs that took decades to declassify and catalog, a different picture emerges. Passages that never appeared in print mention geometric anomalies, visible in the exposed rock faces along the ice edge. At least two separate officers' journals, written independently, describe what can only be called structured stone, not fractured ice, not weathered basalt, but something that gave the impression of deliberate arrangement. Push the inquiry forward, and the trail leads to Karsten Borchgrevink. In 1895, as part of a Norwegian whaling voyage, he and a small party achieved what is now accepted as the first confirmed landing on the Antarctic mainland, not merely sighting the coast or lowering boats for a brief visit, but actually stepping ashore and walking on the continent. 3 years later, in 1898 to 1900, he commanded the Southern Cross expedition and became the first human being to deliberately overwinter on Antarctic soil. At this point, the official record becomes noticeably narrower. It lavishes detail on temperature readings, wind speeds, barometric pressure, penguin specimens, magnetic variations, the hard, measurable data. But when it comes to certain other observations, the language grows vague, almost evasive. Zoologist Nikolai Hansen, only 29 years old, died during that winter. The official cause listed was a digestive condition. Most historical summaries devote a single paragraph to his death. He was buried on a ridge overlooking the bay. Another member of the expedition returned home and spent the rest of his life refusing to discuss Antarctica in public, except once. In 1903, he gave a single interview to a Norwegian newspaper. The most striking portion of that interview was not translated into English until the 1960s. It described crew members suffering repeated episodes of geographic fixation, moments when men became convinced they were seeing organized, artificial structures beneath the ice sheet, shapes that logic insisted could not exist in such a place. Even Borchgrevink's own private writings reveal a curious pattern. He is exhaustive and precise when cataloging supplies, sledging routes, wildlife behavior. But the moment he begins to describe the geology of the interior, rock surfaces scoured clean by wind, he becomes strangely abstract, almost lyrical, and oddly incomplete. He writes of formations that reminded him of something, then the sentence simply stops. In at least 3 surviving private letters, the description of certain rock features is either truncated mid-thought, abruptly diverted to an unrelated subject, or exists in a version that differs substantially from the sanitized reports he submitted to expedition sponsors. Antarctica is not a uniform blanket of ice. There are nunataks, isolated rock peaks piercing the ice, and coastal margins where wind and ablation expose the actual bedrock. From the earliest expeditions onward, explorers repeatedly described formations in these bare zones that unsettled them. Peculiar regularity, sharp right angles, stone alignments that resisted explanation by ordinary weathering. The exact phrases differ: unusual symmetry, regular intervals, stone that did not fracture the way stone should. But the underlying observation recurs again and again across independent accounts, spanning different nationalities and decades. Geologists quite reasonably point to columnar basalt, frost wedging, exfoliation, differential erosion, perfectly natural mechanisms that can produce hexagonal columns, angular fractures, and geometric-looking patterns in volcanic rock. Those processes explain a great deal. But the difficulty lies not in isolated examples of angularity. The difficulty is the distribution. Men from rival expeditions, citizens of competing empires who had no opportunity to compare notes, describe similar anomalous features in widely separated locations along hundreds of miles of coastline. When you plot those approximate sighting points on a map, the clusters do not follow the expected contours of known geological provinces. Instead, they suggest spacing, repetition, arrangement, something on a scale so large that only distance would allow a person to perceive the full pattern. If the conventional explanation is correct, if these were simply natural outcrops misinterpreted by exhausted, disoriented men under extreme conditions. Then one final, stubborn question remains. Why did three separate governments, operating in the same narrow historical window and without any known coordination, all choose to redact, delay, classify, dispute, or quietly bury the raw geological sections of their Antarctic expedition reports? The United States withheld the full, unredacted charts from Wilkes's voyage for years. Portions remained classified long after his death. The British Admiralty received James Clark Ross's complete logs and officers' journals, yet large sections were not made publicly available until well into the 20th century. France published Dumont d'Urville's official account, but scholars familiar with the surviving French crew diaries have repeatedly noted systematic divergences, always in the same narrow category: descriptions of exposed rock, interior coastal features, the character and arrangement of stone. Never the weather data, never the biological collections, never the navigational positions, always the rocks. Three great powers, bitter rivals, no shared diplomatic channels on this matter, yet each treated precisely the same class of information with exactly the same restraint. That level of convergence is no longer coincidence. It is either an astonishing parallel decision that Antarctic geology was somehow too sensitive to reveal fully, or it is evidence that each expedition encountered, or was informed of, something that triggered the identical institutional reflex: contain, edit, omit. I cannot hand you definitive proof of a lost civilization beneath the Antarctic ice. What I can point to is a growing body of serious, non-fringe scholarship, work by architectural historians, historical geographers, specialists in pre-modern cartography that has been accumulating quietly for decades. It suggests the possibility of a far older, far more geographically extensive human presence than the standard timeline permits, and one whose physical traces were erased with unusual thoroughness. You have almost certainly encountered isolated pieces of this puzzle before. The Peary-Rice map of 1513, the Orontius-Phineas map of 1531, both depicting stretches of Antarctic coastline that appear ice-free and with topographic accuracy that matches modern subglacial surveys conducted only in the late 20th century. The conventional academic response is that these maps were compiled from still older, now vanished sources. That answer is itself an admission. It concedes that someone, at some point long before the 19th century discovery expeditions, possessed accurate knowledge of Antarctica's outline beneath the ice. It simply declines to pursue the obvious follow-up question: who? The thread that begins in 1840 eventually ties back to that larger mystery. If a civilization once existed with the capability to operate across continents, to construct in the most hostile environments, to leave durable marks in stone that could survive hundreds or thousands of years of glacial accumulation, then we are no longer asking whether Antarctica was ever inhabited by humans. We are asking when that habitation ended. And we are asking why every major power, across centuries of bitter competition, somehow arrived at the same collective silence on the subject. Uniform silence from institutions that agree on almost nothing else is not neutral. It is data. This is not merely an academic riddle locked in dusty archives. It is a profoundly human story about what those early expeditions did to the men who sailed on them. Psychological strain, polar madness, was widespread and well documented. Cabin fever, hypoxia, vitamin deficiencies, the hallucinatory distortions of Antarctic light and mirages, fata morgana turning distant ice into phantom cities and ramparts. All of those explanations are real and valid, yet the specific visions that survive in private letters, unpublished journals, and the few censored accounts that slipped into print are not generic or random. They describe architecture on an immense scale, proportions unlike anything European, materials that read as stone rather than timber or brick. layouts implying not isolated structures, but planned districts, grids, arrangements, everything buried, visible only in broken fragments, as though what they glimpsed was merely the exposed corner of something vastly larger, still hidden beneath miles of ice. One unnamed officer, his family is still traceable, so I will not identify him here, wrote a private letter to his brother describing a sequence of walls running along a cliff face for an unguessable distance, features he could not reconcile with any known action of nature or weather. He dutifully reported the sighting to his commanding officer and was instructed to expunge it from his personal log. He obeyed that order for the official record. He did not obey it in the letter to his brother. That letter survived. It was donated to a small regional archive by descendants in 1974. It has been cited in precisely one academic paper, published in a short-lived specialist journal that ceased operations 2 years later. Any single one of these elements can be dismissed as historical noise. A redaction here, a psychological breakdown there, a suspicious death, an incomplete sentence, an old map that shouldn't exist. Taken individually, each is explainable. But when you read them in sequence, when you watch the same pattern of absence and suppression repeat across more than a century, across languages, across governments that loathed one another and had every incentive to expose each other's secrets, yet somehow converged on exactly the same silence, the pieces begin to form a shape that is difficult to ignore. Not a conspiracy in the cinematic sense, something slower, more organic. The gravitational pull of institutions toward protecting a version of reality stable enough for everything else to continue. Because if those formations were truly architectural, if the scale and distribution implied deliberate human intent, then the consequences do not remain politely confined to Antarctica. They cascade backward through every established timeline, every foundational assumption about when, how, and how widely our species has shaped the Earth. 3 expeditions in 1840, one shared, enduring silence. What exactly did they see on those wind-scoured rock margins that caused hardened naval officers to break off mid-sentence? Why do maps drawn centuries before the first steamships reached those latitudes already know the shape of the coast beneath the ice? Why did so many of the men who came closest to the truth come back altered, some psychologically shattered, some unnaturally silent, some dead before anyone could ask them the necessary questions? I do not possess conclusive answers. I will not overreach what the surviving evidence can support. But I know what it feels like to follow these threads one after another, to watch the same voids and omissions echo across generations, across rival empires, across archives that should have been at war with each other, yet somehow agreed on what must never be said. It feels like a door that was closed with great care a very long time ago, and on the far side of that door, beneath ice that has been growing thicker for centuries, across stone that may still carry the faint traces of hands we have no name for, something patient and ancient is waiting for the person willing to speak the question aloud with enough force to make the silence crack. Thank you for watching. If any part of this is stirring questions you haven't seen asked before, leave a comment below. What thread should we follow next?